There are few things in this world more poisonous to the soul of a suburban homeowner than a neighbor who treats your property like public domain. Specifically the kind of neighbor who views your carefully manicured Kentucky bluegrass not as a labor of love, but as a geometry problem where the hypotenuse is a shortcut to the mailbox. For weeks, I had been dealing with Linda Sterling, a woman who lived 2 houses down and treated the entire neighborhood like her personal fiefdom, slashing a diagonal path across my front yard every single afternoon at 3:15 p.m. sharp, armed with a visor, a pair of $100 Lululemon leggings, and an attitude that said the world existed solely to provide traction for her power walking routine. I tried being the reasonable guy. I really did. I started with the friendly wave and the "hey, mind sticking to the sidewalk?" routine, but she just brushed me off like a piece of lint on her shoulder, telling me without even breaking her stride that it's just dirt. "Arthur, relax," before clipping the heads off my prize-winning petunias with her cross-trainers. So when patience ran out and my flower bed looked like a war zone, I realized that politeness was a currency Linda didn't accept, and I decided to cook up a plan that was equal parts petty engineering and theatrical revenge, a series of harmless, buried powder mines timed to explode in a cloud of neon humiliation the moment an entitled foot pressed down on my sod. It wasn't about hurting anyone. Let me be clear about that. It was about making trespassing feel inconvenient in a very colorful, very memorable way. But before I tell you exactly how the Rainbow Wars of Willow Creek Estates went down, do me a favor and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing how far these stories travel. To understand why I went to such absurd lengths, you have to understand the specific geography of arrogance in our neighborhood. Because in Willow Creek, arrogance wears white sneakers and tracks its steps on a Fitbit. Linda Sterling was the kind of woman who would report you for leaving your trash can out 10 minutes past the pickup window, but felt perfectly justified in cutting across private property to shave 3 seconds off her mile time. Those 3 seconds became a daily ritual of contempt, a physical manifestation of the idea that her time was valuable and my space was irrelevant. At first, I treated it like a quirk, maybe she just didn't realize she was doing it. So one Saturday morning I walked out in my sandals, coffee mug in hand, and intercepted her mid-stride, putting on my best neighborly smile. "Hey Linda," I said, keeping it light. "Do me a huge favor and stick to the pavement? I just reseeded that corner, and the soil is pretty soft." She didn't even stop. She just glanced at me over her sunglasses like I was a panhandler asking for change and said, "It's better for my knees to walk on grass. Arthur, concrete is murder on the joints." And then she kept going, leaving a fresh set of divots in the mud I had just smoothed over. That was the moment the switch flipped, because it wasn't ignorance, it was a choice. I tried the passive-aggressive route next, buying one of those cute little wooden signs from the hardware store, the ones with a smiling garden gnome that says, "Please keep off the grass," and I planted it right in the middle of her desire path. The next morning, the sign wasn't just knocked over, it was gone, vanished, and I found it 2 days later stuffed face down in the bottom of her recycling bin on trash day. Coincidence? I think not. So I escalated to a decorative fence, just a low, 12-inch wire border that looked nice, but sent a clear message of "do not enter," thinking surely she wouldn't step over a barrier. But I underestimated Linda's commitment to her shortcut. The first time she approached it, she didn't even slow down. She just high-stepped over it like she was training for the Olympic hurdles, landing squarely on a cluster of pansies and continuing her march without a backward glance. The fence didn't stop her, it just became a prop in her daily athletic performance. By this point, the irritation had metastasized into a full-blown obsession, and every time I saw that fresh trail of flattened grass, it felt like a personal insult, a message written in the dirt that said, "I do what I want." I took the sensible route next, or what I thought was the sensible route, and involved the Homeowners Association, sending an email to the board of Willow Creek Estates, an organization whose bylaws were longer than the Constitution and whose primary function seemed to be making life miserable for people who wanted to paint their front doors anything other than beige. I got a form letter back 3 days later that basically said, "Dear Mr. Pendleton, while we encourage neighborly harmony, the association does not police pedestrian disputes unless there is significant structural damage. We suggest you work this out amongst yourselves. which is corporate speak for stop bothering us unless she burns your house down. I was fuming, so I called the non-emergency police line to ask about trespassing laws. But the dispatcher was patient and annoyingly correct, explaining that unless she refused to leave after being asked or there was a restraining order, walking across a lawn was a civil matter, not a criminal one, and they couldn't station a squad car in my driveway to protect my fescue. The law lived in a different universe than moral justice, and I was realizing that if I wanted this to stop, I was going to have to enforce the boundary myself. The neighborhood had already started taking sides in that quiet, suburban way where nobody says anything directly, but everyone knows what's happening. I saw the elderly couple across the street shaking their heads when Linda stomped through my yard, and I saw the guy next door smirking because he thought my little gnome sign was tacky anyway. I considered a bigger fence, maybe a 6-foot privacy wall, but the HOA required a permit process that took 6 months and a non-refundable deposit, and frankly, I didn't want to live in a fortress. I just wanted my lawn to be a lawn. I even thought about getting a dog. My buddy Dave suggested a Rottweiler with a bad attitude, but the HOA had strict rules about intimidating breeds, and I didn't want the responsibility of a pet just to solve a pest problem. So, I tried the motion sensor sprinkler, the classic weapon of the suburban dad, setting it up right at the corner where she entered, angling the nozzle for maximum soakage. It worked exactly once. Linda got blasted with a stream of cold water, shrieked, and ran off. But the victory was short-lived because 2 hours later, I got an email from the HOA citing me for creating a water nuisance and improper irrigation practices because Linda had marched straight to the office and claimed I ruined her suede walking shoes. That was the breaking point. The moment where I realized the system was rigged against the person trying to follow the rules, and if I wanted to win, I had to stop playing by their book and start writing my own. I needed something that wasn't technically a weapon, something that wouldn't cause injury but would cause such a massive, undeniable inconvenience that she would never, ever step foot on my property again. I wanted consequences, not lectures. I spent the next 3 nights in my garage, channeling every ounce of my engineering degree into a project that was probably beneath my dignity, but felt absolutely essential for my sanity. I started researching safe, non-toxic substances that created a visual impact. Things like cornstarch, food-grade dyes, the kind of stuff they use in those color-run 5 Burmese shots where everyone ends up looking like a tie-dyed t-shirt. It had to be safe. That was my number 1 rule, because if I hurt her, I was the bad guy. But if I just embarrassed her, that was fair game. I sketched out designs for a pressure plate mechanism, something simple that could be buried just below the sod, triggered by the weight of an adult human, but resistant to squirrels or stray cats. I bought plastic Tupperware containers, scavenged springs from old lamps, and ordered 5 pounds of neon-colored cornstarch online, magenta, electric blue, lime green, and a fluorescent orange that looked radioactive. I felt a little bit like a mad scientist, mixing the powders in my garage at 2 a.m., testing the dispersal patterns with a leaf blower to make sure it would create a cloud rather than a projectile. The mechanism was surprisingly simple, a spring-loaded plate inside the container that, when depressed, would release a burst of compressed CO2, just a tiny 12-gram cartridge like you use for a bike tire, forcing the powder up and out through a nozzle hidden in the grass. It wouldn't hurt, it wouldn't bruise, but it would envelop the lower half of anyone standing there in a cloud of clinging, brightly colored dust. I built 6 of them, 6 little landmines of humiliation. To install them without raising suspicion, I hired a local handyman named Dig It Dave, a guy who operated a small landscaping business and knew how to keep his mouth shut as long as the cash was green. I told him I was installing experimental soil moisture sensors for a gardening blog I was writing, which was a flimsy lie, but Dave just nodded and said, "Whatever you say, Artie, just show me where to dig." We spent a Tuesday morning coring out perfect little cylinders along Linda's favorite diagonal path, dropping the devices in, and carefully placing a thin layer of sod over the pressure plates so they were invisible to the naked eye, but sensitive enough to trigger under 100 pounds of pressure. When we were done, the lawn looked pristine, innocent, totally unsuspecting. I paid Dave, sent him on his way, and then I sat down to wait. The anticipation was excruciating, a mix of giddy excitement and the low-level dread that comes from knowing you might be crossing a line from eccentric neighbor to local villain. I checked the weather. Clear skies, low wind, perfect conditions for a powder plume. I set up a camera in my living room window, not because I planned to post it, but because I knew that if this went sideways, I would need objective proof that I hadn't physically attacked her. 3:15 p.m. rolled around, and the neighborhood was quiet, just the sound of distant lawnmowers and the hum of the cicadas. And then, right on cue, she appeared. Linda turned the corner, earbuds in, phone in hand, chattering away to someone about her Pilates instructor, wearing a pristine white tracksuit that must have cost more than my first car. She looked like a commercial for suburban wellness, glowing with entitlement, and as she approached my property line, she didn't even hesitate. She stepped off the sidewalk and onto the grass, her heel digging into the turf, eyes fixed on the horizon, completely unaware that she was walking into a trap. Step 1. Step 2. Step 3. Click. The sound was soft, a pneumatic hiss that you wouldn't hear unless you were listening for it, followed immediately by a poof that sounded like a pillow being punched. A cloud of neon magenta powder erupted from the ground, swirling up around her calves and thighs in a thick, vibrant vortex. Linda froze mid-step, her mouth dropping open in silent shock, her brain trying to process why the ground had just sneezed on her. She looked down at her legs, which were now coated in pink dust, and let out a confused little squeak. Panicked, she took a step backward to get away from the pink cloud, planting her left foot firmly on the second trigger. Poof! Electric blue this time, a massive plume that caught the breeze and wrapped around her waist, settling on her white jacket, her hands, her phone. She screamed then, a high-pitched sound of pure indignation, and started doing a frantic little dance, trying to brush the powder off, which only smeared it deeper into the fabric. She stumbled sideways, trying to reach the safety of the driveway, and hit number 3. Poof! Lime green. It was a masterpiece. She looked like she had been attacked by a rainbow that held a grudge. She was standing there in the middle of my lawn, coughing and sputtering, covered from the neck down in a chaotic mix of colors, her pristine white outfit ruined, her dignity shattered. I watched from behind the curtain, my hand over my mouth to stifle the laughter that was bubbling up in my chest, feeling a sense of satisfaction so profound it was almost spiritual. This was it. This was justice. She spun around, looking for the source of the attack, and her eyes locked onto my window. I didn't hide. I opened the front door and walked out onto the porch, putting on my best face of concern. "Good Lord, Linda," I called out. "Are you okay? Did you run into a parade?" She pointed a shaking, blue-dusted finger at me, her face contorted with rage. "You," she shrieked, and the sound brought neighbors out of their houses up and down the street. "You did this. You booby-trapped your lawn. You assaulted me." "Assaulted you?" I said, walking down the steps, careful to avoid my own minefield. "Linda, I have no idea what you're talking about. It looks like you stepped on some fungal spores. You know, sometimes mushrooms release spores when you disturb them. Maybe if you stayed on the sidewalk, nature wouldn't be so aggressive." "This isn't mushrooms," she yelled, wiping green dust from her forehead and leaving a smear across her face like war paint. "This is paint. You ruined my clothes. My shoes. I'm calling the police. I'm calling the HOA. I'm suing you for everything you have." She stomped away toward her house, leaving a trail of multicolored footprints on the asphalt, looking like a toddler's art project gone wrong. I stood there for a minute, waving at the neighbors who were watching with open mouths, and then I went back inside, locked the door, and waited for the fallout. It didn't take long. Within 20 minutes, a patrol car was in front of my house. 2 officers, one looking weary and the other looking amused, knocked on my door. "Mr. Pendleton?" the older officer asked. "We have a report from your neighbor that you exploded her." "Exploded her?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "That sounds serious. Is she okay?" "She claims you have landmines in your yard," the cop said, trying to keep a straight face. "She's pretty upset, covered in stuff." "Officers," I said, "I'm a gardening enthusiast. I was testing some soil dispersal methods for organic pest control using cornstarch. It's totally non-toxic, biodegradable, food-grade cornstarch. If someone were to, say, trespass on my property while I was conducting these tests, they might get a little dusty. But I've warned her repeatedly not to walk there." The younger cop chuckled. "Cornstarch. Basically baking supplies," I confirmed. The older cop sighed. "Look, sir, technically, If it's harmless, it's not assault. But you can't just rig devices in your yard. That's a liability nightmare. If she tripped and broke an ankle because she was startled, you'd be on the hook. We're not going to arrest you, but you need to disable whatever you've got out there. And stay away from her. They went over to Linda's house to take her statement, and I watched from the window as she screamed at them, waving her stained leggings in their faces, demanding a SWAT team. When they finally drove away without handcuffing me, she stood on her lawn and screamed, "This isn't over, Arthur. You'll hear from my lawyer." And I did. The next week was a blur of legal threats and bureaucratic nonsense. The HOA sent me a stack of violation notices thick enough to choke a horse, fines for unauthorized modification of landscaping, discharge of particulate matter, and creating a neighborhood nuisance. They racked up to about $500. Linda's lawyer sent a demand letter asking for $3,000 to replace her custom athletic wardrobe and compensation for severe emotional distress and PTSD related to lawns. My own lawyer, a buddy from college named Mark, looked at the letters and sighed. "Arthur, this is hilarious, but you're walking a thin line. You can argue that she was trespassing, and in this state, a trespasser assumes certain risks, but juries don't like booby traps, even funny ones. If we go to court, you might win, but it'll cost you 10 grand in fees. Is it worth it?" I had to think about that. Was it worth it? The neighborhood had turned into a circus. Kids were daring each other to run across my lawn to see if they could trigger a color bomb. I saw chalk drawings on the sidewalk marking the danger zone. It was funny, but I was losing sleep. I was worried about a kid getting hurt or a delivery driver getting blasted. The point had been made, but the cost was rising. So, I decided to declare a strategic victory and retreat. I waited for a moonless night, put on my headlamp, and went out with a trowel. I dug up the remaining 3 devices, emptied the powder into trash bags, and filled the holes. I smoothed the sod back over, making the lawn look innocent again. The next morning, I sent a formal email to the HOA and Linda's lawyer. "Dear Board and Council, please be advised that the experimental soil treatment sensors have been removed from the property. The project is complete. No further particulate discharge will occur. However, please note that any future trespassing will be met with high-resolution video surveillance and immediate prosecution under Civil Statute 44B. Stay off my grass." The HOA agreed to waive the fines if I signed a document promising never to install subsurface pneumatic devices again. I signed it with a flourish. Linda never responded directly, but the next day, I saw her walking down the street. She approached my property line, slowed down, and stared at the grass. I could see the gears turning in her head. She wanted to cut across. She wanted to prove she wasn't afraid. But then she looked at the ground, remembering the pink cloud, the green dust, the humiliation. She stayed on the sidewalk. She walked the long way around, her heels clicking angrily on the concrete, and she hasn't stepped 1 foot on my property since. She won't even look at my house when she passes. There was one final twist, though. About a month later, I was sitting on the porch when I saw the neighbor's cat, Mr. Whiskers, sauntering down the driveway. He looked normal, except for his tail, which was glowing a bright, neon orange. I guess I missed a spot when I was cleaning up the powder. Linda saw the cat too, and I heard her screech from her porch. "That animal is contaminated. He's spreading the toxins." Nobody listened to her. The neighborhood kids started calling him Rainbow Kitty, and Mr. Whiskers became a local celebrity. Looking back, was it petty? Absolutely. Was it a little bit dangerous? Probably. But every time I look out at my pristine, untrampled grass, and I see the petunias blooming right where her sneakers used to land, I know it was worth every penny and every moment of stress. I learned that you can't control entitlement, you can't reason with arrogance, but you can, if you're creative enough, make the consequences of bad behavior so colorful that they can't be ignored. So, here's my question to you guys. Did I go too far with the cornstarch landmines? Or was this the only language a person like Linda would understand? Where do you draw the line when polite requests fail? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you've ever had to wage war to protect your own slice of peace and quiet, tell me your story. Thanks for listening, and remember, keep your powder dry and stay off the grass.